In this video, we are going to talk about the mandible, which is the lower jawbone. You can divide the mandible into two main regions. The horizontal part is simply referred to as the body, and the vertical part that extends from the body is called the ramus, which is a Latin word which means branch. And there are two on either side. There's one on either side, so we refer to both of them using the plural form of the word rami. We can note a couple of features that we see on the body in this view. There's an opening over here, a foramen, which is called the mental foramen, and you have two of them, so we refer to both of them as the mental foramina, to pluralize the word foramen. And there is a protruding part right here where you have your chin, and this is referred to as the mental protuberance, essentially because it protrudes from the lower edge of your mandible. Let's consider why it's called the mental foramen and the mental protuberance. The word mental comes from a Latin word, mens, which means mind, and mentation is thinking. So if you consider this famous statue by Rodin, which is called The Thinker, you can see that the subject is resting his chin on his hand as he ponders something. So this part of the head is associated with thinking, hence mental foramen and mental protuberance. Here is a lateral view of the mandible, and again we can note the horizontal part, the body, and over here again the ramus, and here is the mental foramen on this side, and we have our mental protuberance. If we consider the top of the ramus, we'll notice some features. Here we have a process which is referred to as the coronoid process. It's oid, it's like something, and what is it like? It's like a corona, it's like a crown. So this process is called the coronoid process because it suggested a crown to the anatomist. We're going to see other features in anatomy that are also referred to as coronoid, or like a crown. Between the coronoid process and the process where we have our articulation with the temporal bone, we have a notch, and it is simply referred to as the mandibular notch. Then we have the process which is going to form the temporomandibular joint. If we exclude the small bones in the middle ear, this is the only place in the skull where you have a movable articulation. This process is referred to as the condylar process, also known as the condyloid process. And it's called the condylar process because it's a type of process which is known as a condyle. The word condyle refers to the smooth, rounded end of a bone. It's called a condyle because it is elliptical in shape and it resembles a knuckle. The word condyle comes from a Greek word which means knuckle. And we'll see condyles in other places in the skeleton. Of course, we'll see condyle associated with the smooth rounded ends which are going to form your actual knuckles in your hand. Another feature that we can see from this perspective is the way the inferior border of the body turns and becomes the posterior border of the ramus. And these two lines form an angle. And this feature of the mandible is simply referred to as the angle. Now, as Shakespeare once said, repetition is the soul of getting an A in anatomy. Yes, he said that in one of his lesser-known plays, The Comedy of Getting into the Nursing Program. Let's review everything using this figure from Gray's Anatomy. And if we look at an isolated mandible, very nice drawing of an isolated mandible, we can see again the body, the ramus. Associated with the body, we have again the mental foramen, the mental protuberance. On the ramus, we have the coronoid process, the mandibular notch, and the condylar process, also known as the condyloid process. And again, here we have our angle. Note that here the angle is a bit more acute. And this is a variability you're going to notice when you look at different skulls. In other words, the angle can be more obtuse than it is here. Another feature I would like to talk about, you can't really see very well in these last couple of specimens and drawings, so I'd like to turn to the disarticulated skull and take a closer look at the mandible. And notice that in this specimen that they've done some work to open up the body. This reveals for us the fact that you find in the body the roots of the teeth of the lower jaw. And the roots are within alveoli. In other words, they're within sockets. The word alveolus essentially means pocket. And so the roots are contained within these pockets, which you find within the bone. And this part of the bone, which contains these sockets, which hold the roots, is just like with the maxillary bone, referred to as the alveolar process. So the mandible also has an alveolar process. If we take a look at this very nice specimen, upon which a lot of work has been done, as you can see, here again we can see that the place where the roots are found has been opened up for us. And again, we can get a good look at the alveolar process and why it's called the alveolar process here. Also notice that the blood vessels go to the roots. The blood vessels come from the inferior alveolar branch of the blood vessel. And there's a branch called the mental branch, which is going to come out through the mental foramen, which is indicated over here. Now, let's look at the mandible from an interior view, in other words, a medial view of the mandible. When we look at it from this view, we can note that there is an opening that we find in the ramus, or near where the ramus joins the body. And this opening is referred to as the mandibular foramen. And it is going to be the place that allows the inferior alveolar branch of the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve to enter the bone. It's also going to allow the blood vessels to enter and leave the mandible. We just saw these blood vessels from the other side. Clinically, this is an important spot. It's the spot where, if you're a dentist, you try to inject the anesthetic when you want to work on a tooth in the lower jaw. The dentist feels for this location and injects the anesthetic close to this opening. Also, another feature to note here is a line, which is a linear raised region that you find on the bone. And you can see it here. It's somewhat subtle, but here it is. This is its location. And this line is referred to as the mylohyoid line. Here is a drawing that'll show us the same features. You can see again the mandibular foramen, and here again is the mylohyoid line. If we go back to the human mandible and look at the other side, we could again see here the mandibular foramen, and here again is the mylohyoid line. And notice on this side that the attachment point of a muscle, which is called the mylohyoid muscle, is indicated by the blue marking here. And you can see the attachment of the muscle is right below the mylohyoid line. We'll talk about the muscle in a future video. The word mylos comes from a word that means molar, and hyoid is a bone that attaches to the anterior aspect of the skull by soft tissue. And you can see why it's called the mylohyoid line. It originates near the roots of the molars and slants down towards the hyoid bone. This ends our video. If you'd like to take a quiz, there is a link to a quiz below. Here is a list of image attributions. And finally, this is Apollo again, my assistant, doing what he does best to help me, which is essentially to stay out of my way.